This is a video about autonomy as it relates to the ethical obligation that professionals have to respect the autonomy of clients. I'm going to proceed, and I don't know why the beach ball. I'm going to proceed by looking at 4 different elements related to autonomy. The first is about what the term autonomy means. Second is one of the sources of the way the concept of autonomy is used in ethics, which is the natural rights tradition of political theory that comes from about the 16th through the 18th centuries. Then autonomy as a condition, in contrast to it being a right. A condition meaning an attribute of a person or a way a person can behave. And then move into informed consent as a way that autonomy is practiced in professions. So by professions, of course, I'm talking about medical doctors, lawyers, college faculty, dentists, those kinds of things, who provide for certain needs of clients that they generally can't provide for themselves because they lack the expertise and or it's just not feasible for them to do it for themselves. So we'll get into how that relates to the professional-client relationship a little bit as well. Okay, first of all, the term autonomy. The roots of the word autonomy are from Greek, ancient Greek, auto meaning self and nomos meaning law or legislation or rule. So the etymological sense of autonomy is a kind of self-legislation or self-regulation. And that's important to the way the term is used in the ethics business because it doesn't mean just doing whatever. It's not just sort of free liberty to do anything at all. It implies that you are a rational being, that you are acting in a rational fashion. And it implies also that you have self-control and that you are following in a lawful way the reasoning that you conduct as a way of conducting yourself, as a way of behaving. So it makes certain presumptions about a person's capacity. Generally, when it's used as a principle of professional ethics, clients are assumed or presumed to have the right to make autonomous choices about services, and they're presumed to be able to make those choices. When you go to a physician because you have some kind of need, the assumption is that you can make choices about the service that the physician provides for you, the treatment for your ailment or whatever it is. And it's presumed that you are able to make those choices, that you're competent, to use the word that I'll talk about it a little bit later on. So that, if you're an adult, you go to a physician, you have the right to choose among the options that the physician presents to you. And it's presumed that you can. Some of the stuff we'll read makes that more problematic, but this is the sort of baseline idea. Another way of thinking about that is that this is kind of a simplification of what really goes on and gives a kind of idealized picture of how things go. So moving on to the natural rights tradition and how it affects the way we understand autonomy, at least in the United States. It's different in different cultures, which we'll talk about too. The natural rights tradition predominantly is a British tradition, at least as it applies in the United States. And this concept of a natural right comes from 2 main sources in British philosophy: Thomas Hobbes's book, The Leviathan, and John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. And it was from Locke in particular that Thomas Jefferson got language of the Declaration of Independence, in particular this phrase that that a lot of people know really well. In fact, it's practically plagiarizing John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Okay, so I've highlighted some words there. To say that something is self-evident means that we assume that it's true, that it's a starting point for everything that we understand about these truths. There's no argument about them. They're beyond question, or simply that they're assumed. And what is it that they're assuming as a basis for understanding human rights? Well, that we're created equal as it comes to those rights. In other words, no one's right is superior to another person's right. This was really important for Locke because he was arguing against the divine right of kings. It's important in the Declaration of Independence because it was also making the claim that it's the right of the individuals in the colonies to determine their own direction. That they're endowed means that it is part of their nature. It's called the natural rights tradition because the idea is that these rights are part of what it is to be a human being. So it's in the nature of a human being. That's the endowed idea. By their Creator, in fact, implies that it's because you are a human being that you have these rights. To say that they're unalienable means that nothing can take them away. You can't trade them away, you can't sell them, no one can take them away from you. So when Jefferson gets to listing those rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, life, enough said. The government does not have the right to limit your life. I know that it seems odd that there was and is capital punishment, and yet one of the founding documents of our nation says that you have the unalienable right to life. Locke made the argument that you freely enter into a kind of, to use the terminology, social contract with the government, and it is in fact your own will that's being enacted in the laws of the state. If you vote for a legislator, what that legislator decides to do, to vote on, the laws that those legislators pass, it's in effect your will that is causing that legislation to happen. And so it's not really against your right to life. It's actually an enactment of your right to life that there could be capital punishment. I don't know whether that argument's compelling to y'all, but John Locke made that argument. In any case, liberty just means freedom. Hobbes famously said that in the state of nature, that is, prior to there being any kind of society or government, everyone's liberty is limitless. But as a result of everyone's liberty being limitless, there was nothing that was criminal, there was nothing that could be punished, there was no authority to punish any crime. Well, there would be chaos. A war of all against all, he described it as. And then Hobbes' famous phrase to describe it is that life in these conditions would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So it's in trying to protect our liberty and our lives that we form societies, that we form governments. But those governments are only legitimate to the extent that they protect these rights. Finally, pursuit of happiness. Well, in Locke's original that Jefferson plagiarized, the third right is the right to property. Jefferson and the founders were a little concerned about any statement that suggested that people had a right to property. In the colonies, there were people who were property. And I'm not just talking about the slaves from Africa. There were also indentured servants from the British Isles, mainly, who did not have the right to property and who were, in effect, property for a time. So my feeling is that Jefferson included the phrase pursuit of happiness to avoid saying that we had the right to property, and in order to have three things on the list. Because otherwise, I don't know what pursuit of happiness means other than using your liberty. It seems extraneous, unnecessary. In any case, main things are to understand that these rights are supposed to be unalienable. They can't be taken away. And that they're equal. They're the same for everybody. It has an effect because this is an idea that is reflected in a lot of U.S. law, and so it affects how we understand and apply autonomy in situations like consulting a doctor and choosing a treatment option. So when connected together with the idea of liberty, in practice, what I think we mean by autonomy in the ethics business is the right of a competent adult person to make decisions for themselves. I should change that. That's a binary way of addressing things, and that's not appropriate. Anyway, the right of a competent adult person to make decisions for themselves. So, the obvious question is, what makes somebody competent to make decisions for themselves? And that leads us into the idea of autonomy as a condition. A basic distinction is made between competent persons and incompetent persons. How the distinction is made is really complex. A competent person is a person whose right and capacity to make decisions for themselves is evident or is not questioned or is respected directly. An incompetent person is somebody whose right or capacity to make decisions for themselves is questioned or is not followed or something like that. One might ask, is the request that Jewel Schupping made to her psychologist, is that the request of a competent or incompetent person? The Mueller article, which I was critical of, it seems to me what she's doing in that article is trying to find a basis for claiming that people who want amputations as treatment for BIID are necessarily incompetent. They're mentally ill, therefore incompetent. And because they're incompetent, they can't really make this choice. That, I think, is the thrust of the article. So, what makes somebody competent or incompetent? Case law, that is, legal findings that are the result of people suing each other, have come up with a very basic sketch of what it means to be a competent person. And by basic, I mean really rough. A competent person is somebody who is 18, conscious, because you don't make decisions when you're asleep, or, say, in a coma. Sane, which tends to mean being able to acknowledge and recognize the difference between different options presented to you. And rational, which is just another way of saying the same thing. Being able to understand your situation and make choices about it. So, an incompetent person is just somebody who lacks those things. In general, for most purposes, this is how that distinction gets made. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying that in general, for most purposes, that's how this decision is made. Is somebody competent or not? Well, let's take Jewel Schupping as an example. Was she under 18? No, she was an adult woman. Was she unconscious? No, because she actually was able to voice her request. Was she insane? Well, that depends on what we mean by the legal idea of insanity or the ethical concept of insanity. If she was able to understand what she was requesting and understand the end result, then in some basic way, she seems to be sane. Another way of talking about this, if you're not psychiatrically diagnosed as psychotic, then probably you would be regarded as sane for purposes of deciding whether you were competent to make choices for yourself. Was she irrational? Was she ignoring the circumstances she was in? Was she acting merely on a whim? Might have been used as a way of determining whether she was competent or not. That's getting into some very dicey areas, though. Based on that, off-the-cuff analysis, it seems like she was probably competent to make that request. It doesn't mean that the psychologist needed to agree and follow her wishes. It just means that as a requester, she was exercising her autonomy in a competent fashion. But remember that everybody's autonomy is going to be equal. The psychologist is equally autonomous to refuse the request. She can't force him to do it. And I say him because it was a him. So, as rough as this is, there's obviously problems with it and issues with it. First, how do you determine who's competent and who's incompetent? Does your medical doctor have the right set of skills to determine whether you're competent or incompetent? I once saw, this is kind of a fun story. I went to graduate school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh used to be a steel town. Steel workers worked for 12 hours a day in the bad old days before unions, and in front of 1,000-degree ovens using tongs to pull pig iron around. And when they got off their shift, they were thirsty. Pittsburgh, consequently, has a lot of bars in it. At least it did when I lived there. My roommate in grad school invited me out for a beer when he got home from his classes one day, and we walked down the street to this bar near our house. It was a row house that we rented. And while we were there, a woman came into the bar. There was some talk about her. She went up to the bar. She demanded a drink. The bartender refused her a drink, and she collapsed onto the floor of the bar. The floor was disgusting, by the way. Well, they called paramedics. Paramedics came in, and she sort of came to. She had fainted or something when she collapsed. And when she came to, the EMTs asked her if she would like to go to a hospital. They asked her if she wanted different kinds of treatment, oxygen, and get her vital signs and things like that, and she refused them. And essentially got up, got back on her bar stool, and asked for a drink again. And the bartender refused again. The EMTs then just kind of waited around. She passed out again, and then they put her on a gurney and took her to a hospital. What they decided, and I have found by teaching this course that this is not an uncommon thing for paramedics to do. What they had decided to do is wait until she was not conscious, and then, since she wasn't conscious, she would have been incompetent, and they could provide standard of care for her regardless of her expressed wishes earlier. So, in that instance, it was basically the paramedics who determined her incompetency and then waited for her to express it by passing out. It's an odd way to treat somebody when it's looked at through the lens of this concept of the patient's right to autonomy. In any case, competency is generally presumed for people who are not that strange woman if you're over 18, and incompetency is presumed for people under 18, except sometimes 21 for certain choices, and sometimes 12 for certain choices. Texas is one state, for instance, that will prosecute 12-year-olds as adults for felonies. So you're regarded as having the capacity to form intent to commit a felony at age 12 in the state of Texas, because that's what's required to be a competent and be tried as an adult. Is that right or wrong? I'm not saying. I'm just telling you that there are some choices there where you're competent at age 12. This is all very odd. We draw the lines somewhere in law, and where we draw the lines in law depends a lot on who sues whom and who wins and so forth. 18 is a completely arbitrary time, and that's the point of my mentioning these other ages. And what happens when you turn 18? When I went to sleep, age 17 years, 364 days, did something magical happen overnight that suddenly the next day I was competent? Did the autonomy fairy come and spring autonomy dust over me? It's a line we draw. Another way of raising questions about autonomy comes from this very important medical ethics guy named Samuel Gorovitz. This was from an article written in the 70s that's in a lot of professional ethics anthologies. And I think for a reason. It's a way of describing how informed consent should happen, how autonomy should be respected by physicians. So, what conditions have to be met for a person to be competent? The idea here is that it's probably not just all or nothing. It's not like a switch goes off and suddenly you're competent. There are other things that matter about a person's competence or incompetence. Gorovitz tells the story of a woman who had just given birth, and the newborn infant, had a fistula, which is a hole, between the two ventricles of its heart. This happens every once in a while, and there's a surgical procedure to repair, basically sew together, so that the two ventricles do not leak into each other. The problem being that deoxygenated blood in the one ventricle will flow into oxygenated blood in the other, and the result is that the baby doesn't get enough oxygen in its body overall. So, in the instance that Gorovitz wrote about, a surgeon came in to tell the woman what was needed and explain the surgery, and drew a quick, very very rough, I'll call it, diagram that I redrew from the picture that Gorovitz used. And it looks kind of like this. So the blood flows in to the one ventricle, or to the one, what are the other upper chambers called? Anyway, into the upper chamber of the heart, comes down into the lower chamber of the heart where it gets pumped out into the lungs. It returns from the lungs and is pumped back out into the body. And the problem is the fistula, which allows the blood to leak in between those two lower parts, the ventricles. An attending physician then later on asked her if she understood the surgery that she had consented to. And she said, "Yes, I do understand the problem. My baby has a square heart." What went wrong, Gorovitz asks? Well, a number of things. Was she competent to make this choice? She had just had a child. and a surgeon was coming and telling her that her newborn infant needed to have surgery done, emergency surgery done, she might have been pretty freaked out. I've had problems with anxiety for most of my life, and I know that when I'm pretty anxious, I'm not entirely rational sometimes, and I'm certainly not at my best for making complicated decisions or to take in information that's complicated, like the information about the surgery. Gorowitz's target in the article is that the surgeon needed to not just inform the patient, but communicate with the patient, make sure the patient understood what was really going on, speak to the patient in a way the patient could understand, and so on. So really interesting articles, and it's ahead of its time, because in the 1970s, very much of the ethics literature was kind of cut and dry when it comes to how they viewed autonomy. So, was she competent or not? Well, we don't really know. And that's the big problem. So this idealized picture of autonomy and of competency isn't really what goes on in practice. So here are some problems with our natural rights heritage that we still have. It's still part of the way we view autonomy, but there are limitations and problems with it. First, it's a kind of all or nothing view of autonomy. You're either autonomous or you're not autonomous, competent or not competent. And part of my reason for bringing in Gorowitz is to show that that's not always so simple. The presumption of an equal right and capacity is just false. We don't all have the same capacity. And I would argue that we don't even have the same right. If Bill Gates needed to make a complicated medical decision about a surgery that cost a lot of money, Bill Gates has a lot of money. So his options when it comes to his medical care are far more extensive than yours or mine. So there's no real recognition of the difference in autonomy and power between the professional and the client, and how that can affect how the professional informs the client and how the client receives that information. Cultural differences can make a big difference when it comes to that. There's a really good book by a woman named Anne Fadiman called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down, and it's about the medical care and the difficulty of a Hmong girl, I believe. It's been a while since I read it. And I believe she has some kind of epilepsy. And being able to take care of her was really difficult because of cultural differences and language differences between the Hmong folks and the folks who were the sort of professional medical team. It's a really interesting book. If autonomy is limited, which is part of what Cooperman suggests, and it develops, then those with limited autonomy who still have the right to autonomy, and if that right to autonomy still exists, then it's still deserving of moral respect and consideration. In other words, respecting limited autonomy means helping to extend it. There's an article where that you will read next week that deals with this, so I'll let you think about that when you read that article. Finally, pretty briefly, there's this concept called informed consent that you're probably familiar with. Informed consent is what we do in practice. When making decisions about treatment provided by doctors, for instance, autonomy is exercised through informed consent. You've probably signed an informed consent document for some kind of medical care. The document is supposed to tell what your treatment is going to be, and your signature, if that's how it does it, is you consenting to it. So it's a way of expressing the autonomy of a patient. Possibly, we could look at the syllabus of a course as a kind of informed consent between the professional, me, your faculty member, and you, students. I inform you of what the class involves and so forth, and you consent to it by remaining enrolled, basically. So, informed consent involves documentation of what's going to happen, of what the options are, of what potential side effects there could be, and so forth. And then it also documents the client's choice. But what makes informed consent really informed consent? An article by several medical ethicists about this said that the aspects of real informed consent deal with the doctor-patient relationship itself, and the respect for self-determination of patients, which is supposed to be practiced by informed consent. And then finally, by medical practice itself. Let me make these concrete and show why this would be relevant. Go back to Jewel Shipping asking for her psychologist to blind her with drain cleaner. So the ethical side of the informed consent issue, Paterick et al. Tell us have these three factors to it. What is the nature of the doctor-patient relationship? Was it common for Jewel Shipping to make requests like this to her psychologist? How well did her psychologist understand what she was going through? Questions that you yourselves have asked about the situation. They're good questions to ask. What kind of practice do psychologists engage in? Then, respecting the self-determination of patients. Does respecting Jewel Shipping's right to make decisions for herself mean that the psychologist had to agree? I don't think so. I think that there's a way that respecting the self-determination of clients, patients, students doesn't mean that you have to do what they ask. There's a way in which you can decline in a respectful way. And then finally, with regard to medical practice, what is the practice? What's within the scope of the practice? Psychologists are not, for instance, professionals at blinding people with drain cleaner. So from this point of view, from the point of view in this Paterick article, which you're not going to read, the scope of the practice of medicine is really important to understanding what is it a client can actually request. Some questions about informed consent that come up. Some questions about withdrawing consent. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't withdraw your consent. What if you consented to having a tooth removed and a crown put in by your dentist? You know, a root canal. Can you plausibly, partway through, withdraw your consent to this procedure? Can you say to the dentist, "Whoa, wait, cool it, I changed my mind"? How will that go? What are the limits to withdrawing your consent? You can withdraw your consent from taking a course by disenrolling, right? By dropping the class. The university frequently puts limits on when you can drop a class. So withdrawing your consent is possible, but up to a point. There are emergency exceptions to informed consent. I described one of them when the paramedics waited for the woman to pass out in the bar. That's called an emergency exception. One way of interpreting what's going on there is she can't practice in any way her autonomy, so it can be basically ignored, and standard of care can be provided to her. In other words, what you would provide to anybody. A therapeutic exception suggests that there are situations in which you should not provide informed consent because of the need to provide the care immediately. Then there's a problem of the paradox of choice. Making choices is not necessarily a great thing. Some people face decisions in ways that are sort of denial-like. Sometimes we want to handle decision-making that's difficult by not making a decision. Often, not making a decision is still making a decision, of course. But the paradox of choice is that it sometimes feels unfree to be free. It sometimes feels more like a burden. How do you practice informed consent? How, as a professional, do you respect and fulfill your responsibility to respect the autonomy of a client? When your client faces these choices unwillingly, when your client faces choices that have been thrust upon them by their circumstances or by life, what can you do to be respectful of the autonomy of patients, clients, students, when their choices seem burdensome to them? Just an interesting and kind of deep question about it. So that's this little bit. I hope that it helps explain a little about the informed consent and the kind of standard way that the autonomy of clients tends to be treated.